We're talking like normal, like, okay, so we have this patient here, you're gonna do this, what exposure you wanna set? And both of us just just staring at each other, you know. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel and welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Donna from radiating.com, and today I have a video for you all about how to choose the best exposure factors, how to learn them as well, and how to apply them with your patients. So let's get into that. I'm in need of an X-ray. The first thing I want you to consider is your part size. So let's just pause on that one point for just a quick minute and let me just touch on another factor that will affect that, right? That will affect the exposures that you use. First of all, with radiation or X-ray exposure, to be more specific, right? We look at KVP, which is kilovoltage peak, and MAS, which is milliamperes per second. Kilovoltage peak has to do with the strength of the beam and how far it travels. So if you have a part here, you're looking at how much the beam is allowed to pass through that part, right? And when you're looking at MAS, that has to do with the amount of X-rays that are produced in a given time period, right? Well, a second. So when we talk about choosing the best exposure for your part size, you need to have enough strength to penetrate that part and enough X-rays to visualize the anatomy that you're looking at. So if you have a bigger part size or a thicker part size or even a more dense part size, you will want to increase your KVP exposure and your MAS in a lot of cases. I do want to quickly mention the 15% rule. I wanted to do a video on that. I don't think I did that yet, so maybe that might be my next video, just to quickly explain the 15% rule. So, bigger part size, raise your exposure, right? So that's your part size that you need to consider. The next thing you're going to consider about the patient is the type of contrast you're looking for. Yes, let me not even use my hand as an example. I may be needing an X-ray on somebody's neck, right? We have two types of lateral neck X-rays that we would do. One to see the spine, one exposure to see the spine, and another exposure to see the soft tissue, like the throat, the trachea, esophagus, etc. So if a patient swallowed a foreign body, you want to see lower contrast. You want more scales of gray, right? So therefore, your KVP will be affected by that, right? Fundamentally or theoretically, when we talk about kilovoltage peak or KVP, the higher the KVP value, the lower the contrast will be. The lower the KVP value, the shorter the contrast scale would be. So you'll have more black and white versus if you take X-ray with a very high KVP, you'll have more grays in between, right? So if you want a high contrast image or an image where you're looking at bone versus soft tissue or whatever, for the bone, you will want to use a lower KV and maybe you'll give a little more MAS. Remember, the more dense an item is or an object is, you will have more absorption of the beam, right? So you might want to raise your MAS a little bit. Now mind you, we have standard exposures throughout all the different machines. There are standard exposure factors that the machine brand will recommend, and I do think that you should make it a point, if you're not familiar with exposures at all, to whenever you go on a clinical site, ask to see the exposure chart, or if you see the exposure chart, take a picture of it, take it, write them down, practice it and stuff like that. And in general, when you see random people in the street or your family or whatever, think to yourself, okay, this is the size of their hand. What exposure I might use for that with the humerus, or point in the humerus? This is the size of XYZ. This is what they're looking at. What kind of exposure I think I should use? And that kind of helps too. I kind of all over the place, but I just want to give you all practical tips as I'm talking. I don't want to be too structured and to do X and then do Y and then no, right? Because you have to like look at the factors that you're given and create a proper exposure to suit that, so that you don't underexpose or overexpose the patient. So now that we have the part size that we know the type of contrast that we're looking for, whether it's high contrast or low contrast, the next thing that you need to consider is, well, I know I mentioned the part size in terms of thickness, but I want to add this into a separate point. I quickly mentioned it, but I want to make it its own point. You need to also consider the density of the item that you are going to be x-raying, because if I have a patient, for example, somebody around my age or somebody in their 30s, right? Let's say a 30-year-old, average size like myself, and they need an x-ray of their humerus, right? And they are muscular, though a little denser, muscular. For me to penetrate through that humerus without getting an image that is underexposed where I could barely see any detail, I need to have a solid exposure and maybe even increase my exposure slightly to compensate for that muscular, dense, thicker anatomy. Versus if I was x-raying a humerus on an elderly patient who has very soft skin, not much muscle mass, you know, I don't want to go too high up, otherwise I might somewhat burn the image. And we use the term burn when we use too much MAS, because when you say burn, it usually means to darken something, and when you apply plenty MAS, you add more darkness to the image. It's a whole lot of theory, right? As I was talking about that there, another point came to me that I think that you should really consider, so you'll know if to raise your exposure or lower your exposure. And that point is pathology. So if it is that your patient is a smoker, for example, a known smoker, they even mention that they smoke a lot and they get chest pain and whatever, you're expecting to see some kind of scarring of the lung tissue. Of course, you're not going to actually see scars when you take the x-ray, but you'll see some more brighter or whiter areas, and that could be due to some kind of issue related to the smoking, right? So the lung tissue will be more dense, it will be more scarred, it will show up as whiter because it will absorb more of the x-rays in that section versus being darker or black, or what you would expect a traditional chest x-ray to look like. So if you're aware of an issue like that, where you know you have to penetrate through something, or you know your patient has some kind of issue, cirrhosis or whatever, then you would want to adjust your exposures accordingly, right? You might raise the MAS a bit, or you would implement the 15% rule to get a bit more penetration, which makes you feel like you're doubling the MAS, so it will add that extra darkness without totally blowing out the lungs, just a little more KVP to get through that tougher tissue. Similarly, if you have a patient who has, I don't know, let's say a lot of fluid in the abdomen, though the abdomen might feel very dense, depending on the size of the abdomen, of course. If it's like really, really big, then you will have to go up with your KVP and you will definitely have to increase your MAS. But if you have an average size patient and their abdomen feels very palpable and soft, similarly as the point I made before, you would want to lower your exposure because they don't have that dense tissue that you're going through. You're going through fluid, you're going through water, or you might be going through a hemorrhage, so that's blood, right? You don't want to expose and over darken the image. You want to have a good base to work with. Even if you need to window a little bit, it's not going to affect it where you have to repeat the image, right? So if I'm thinking back on it, the things that I mentioned is part size, right, which includes the thickness, part density, which includes the material, whether your tissue is softer, firmer, muscular, etc. Pathology, right? And what else is there? Grids. So you need to consider whether you're using a grid or not. That will affect your exposure. If I'm doing a knee out of the bucky, then I'm just putting the cassette directly under the patient's knee. I could lower my exposure because I don't have a grid to absorb all those low energy forces. Again, with these extremities, when you're looking at grid versus outer grid, things like forearm, let's say I have a trauma patient, you have to do a forearm in the grid, in the bucky where you have a grid, or you do it outer bucky, like versus that. Your exposure isn't going to be dropping or raising depending on the condition exponentially. Like it's not going to be an exaggerated exposure where it's so different where you can't even think what could I possibly put. Like you're going to be choosing or changing your exposure by small quantities, because remember, for example, if you're doing an elbow out of the bucky, so the cassette directly under the elbow, the hand is resting on the cassette itself, then chances are your exposure are going to be about 53.5 or 55 KVP and maybe about 2.5 MAS for the average elbow size. But if you put it in bulky, you're going to have the grid absorbing some of those X-ray photons. So you would want to compensate for that by going up. You might go up to about 60 kVp to get a little extra penetration in there to make sure those X-rays hit the film as it passes through the grid, right? Or your MAS, of course, will also slightly increase, not by too much. Maybe you might just raise it by 1 factor, which according to your X-ray tube, if you're going from 2.5, the next level up would be like 2.8 MAS. So it really depends, right? So your grid size also has a part to play in that. What I do want to say though, as a student, you'll go to many sites where you might feel a little flustered or overwhelmed because you're seeing that this particular hospital uses, for example, for a chest X-ray, they might use their average exposure would be about 106 kVp and maybe 2.5 MAS, and then you will go to another hospital and you realize, or another clinic, and you see that they tend to use much higher exposures, like 120 KVP. Alright y'all, so my card was full. I had to go and see about that real quick. I did not expect to talk this much. Anyway, so as I was saying, different hospitals have different exposures, and as a student, I highly recommend getting a notebook, looking at exposure charts, looking at general day-to-day exposures you would see being taken in order to create a baseline that's best for you at the site that you're working at. Get a baseline exposure that would work for the average size patient so that you would know, okay, this patient look a little smaller, so maybe I would drop the KVP by about 2 or 3, maybe, and for this particular patient I'll raise the MAS, you know. So that's where you can have something to play off of and commit these things to memory. A lot of times, especially nowadays, my goodness, I see a lot of students on site who in practicum 2 who has well over a month, 2 months, 3 months clinical experience and can't even give a ballpark exposure. You ask them, okay, so what's the exposure that would be good for this hand or for this chest? And they are so hesitant to give. And it's not like if I'm the one of those radiographers that would make you uncomfortable or be like harsh with you or anything like that. No, like we're talking like normal. Like, okay, so we have this patient here, gonna do this, what exposure you wanna set? And both of us just staring at each other, you know. It's very awkward. It's awkward for you, but it's awkward for me too, you know. I want to see that you are confident. So please get a notebook, write down some exposures, think about them, reflect on them, because you'll need to practice, right? Practice committing it to memory, because as a radiographer today, I don't have to think necessarily what exposure. I know that a chest is about 100, depending on the place, 110 kVp and 3.2 MAS for a slightly larger than average patient. I know that an elbow is 55 kVp and 2.5 MAS. I know for a foot, or for like, let's say a toe, I'll give like 49-ish, depending on the size of the part, kVp, and maybe 1.8 or even 1.6 MAS. I know that for a little child, I will give about 50 kVp and maybe 1.6 MAS for a chest X-ray. I know that for an abdomen, I'll give about 75 to about 80, maybe even 85 kVp if the patient bigger, and about 28 MAS or 32 MAS depending on the patient size. Like, these are things I don't even really need to think about. You know that skull work is around the late 70s to the mid 80s in KVP, and between about 20, 22 MAS upwards to about at most maybe 28 MAS. So like 70 something, 80 something KVP, 20 something, late 20s MAS. Like, it just comes naturally because you're doing it, you're setting exposures. Maybe you'll have a patient where you need to pause and say, okay, this is my baseline, but this patient's a little need a little more or need a little less, and you just tweak your exposure to suit. You know, so these things need to start coming naturally. Yes, in the beginning, you're not expected to know everything, but as you go on in the program, as you try to get competencies, as you try to get your assessments done, like, we want to know that you're confident about these things, you know. The very last point I want to talk about is cast. So if your patient is wearing a cast, usually What I like to do, and I see that this works for me, so maybe you can try this like a kind of cheat code into getting the best exposure for a patient wearing a cast. You would want to, so the button that you're pressing, right, you're going to press it about 3 to 4 times. So for your KVP, you press it about 3 to 4 times to increase the KVP value, and for the MAS about 3 to 4 times as well. So for example, if I have a wrist, and usually for that particular wrist I would want to give about 50 KVP and about 2.5 MAS. This is very random, right? If that is the combination I want to use for this particular patient, I would definitely press the KVP a few times. So from 50, it will go up to 51, then it will go up to 53.5, and then it will go up to 55. So if I usually get 55, then my KVP exposure, KVP value, is going to go up by about 5 KVP for that cast to compensate the extra penetration for the cast. Now mind you, the cast could be a hard cast or just a padded cast with cloth, right? With the cotton layer and the cloth wrapped around. So if it's a hard cast versus that, maybe instead of going up by 4 kVp, you might just go up by 2 kVp, you know. And for the MAS, similarly, you press it about 3 to 4 times at most, and usually that's sufficient. So if for that same wrist I will give on 50 kVp and 2.5 MAS, now I will be given 55 kVp, and if the MAS was 2.5, one button up, one button increase is 2.8. The next button increase is 3.2. The next button increase is 3.6. The next button increase is 4. So for a wrist, the most I will give is 4 MAS with a cast. So you kind of see how it plays. Like it actually ends up working out like basically 100% of the time. That's just something I noticed. So essentially, your exposure, is gonna almost. So if you think about it, 2.5 to about 4 is your, I don't want to think it. You're probably increasing your KVP by about 5 to 8 KVP for a cast, and for the MAS, you're increasing it from about, you're almost doubling your MAS. You have to say it safely, almost, not fully, because most times you don't need 5 MAS or 6 MAS for a cast of a wrist or a hand, right? So yeah, you could use that same thing for a knee. If you have a knee that casts in a full leg cast and you just need the knee alone, instead of doing 55 kVp and your outer bucky, you will go up to about 60, maybe 63 or something like that for the knee. At most, if it's like a bigger part, you might go up to about 68, but that's real pushing it, right? You don't want very low scale contrast. You want to get some bony detail as well. So you have to kind of see what's best for the patient, right? Yeah, and then for the MAS, you might go up from a knee. Let me say that size a knee, you might have given them 4 MAS because of the part size a little bigger. Then maybe at the most, you would go up to about 8 MAS, right? So 4.5 to 8, you almost double it. KVP, you increase it by about 5 to 8, maybe at the most about 10, but usually it really depends. Right, so y'all, I did not expect this video to go on this long, but I know that it was informative. I know that somebody will be helped by this video somehow, somewhere. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching, and let me just leave you all with, don't mind my nails because they're not done and they're very grown out. I just want to show you all my new markers, and they're adorable. Oh my gosh, it's me. It's so funny. It's my icon for my YouTube channel. I just wrote left and right on it so that I don't get mixed up. I got it from Crafty Crafts. Trinidad is a fellow radiographer who made them, and I love them. They are so adorable. And well, as for the actual picture, I just gave her it because so that she could print it, whatever, and put it on here. The picture, I got a cartoonized version of myself from an Etsy designer. So anywho, thanks so much for watching, and thanks so much for listening, and for listening to that shenanigans at the end. If you listened to it recently, about a month ago, I lost my right marker. I know, it really hurt my heart, so I had to order more. And actually, I really love these, so I don't, you know, it's been like 7-8 years, like so since I was a new student and first bought my markers. So yeah, I'm not missing out on anything anymore. I love my new markers and I'm rambling, so bye.